Welcome, night wanderer. As the world settles into stillness, let me take you somewhere cold, quiet, and ancient. We're not visiting royal castles tonight. There will be no golden goblets or armored knights. Instead, we journey to the frost-bitten edge of history, to the dim, wind-rattled homes of medieval peasants who faced brutal winters without heat, beds, or modern comforts. They were the forgotten survivors, ordinary men, women, and children who didn't make it into the songs or scrolls. But when winter came with its teeth bared, these villagers fought back, not with swords or armies, but with clever tricks, human warmth, and a kind of courage born only in the absence of luxury. How did peasants survive the freezing cold in medieval times? Tonight, we answer that question, not with dates and numbers, but with texture, with breath, with firelight flickering against mud-plastered walls. So take a breath, feel the blanket over you. Let the hum of your room fade into imagined snowstorms and smoky huts. Because what you're about to hear is not just history, it's how humanity, at its coldest, most fragile moment, refused to disappear into the frost. Now imagine this. You're not waking up to central heating or double-glazed windows. You're in a hut, a small one, made of mud, straw, sticks, and, perhaps most importantly, hope. The walls, they're so thin you can hear a bird sneeze outside. There's no insulation, no bricks, no cozy wooden panels, just a lattice of branches smeared with mud and animal dung, a construction method called wattle and daub. It's charming if you're a historian, less so if you're living inside it while frost forms on your blanket. Windows. If you're lucky, there's a hole cut in the wall, covered with cowhide or oiled cloth that flaps like a flag in the wind. And there's no glass, not unless you're a noble or a church. The bitter wind, of course, finds every crack. It dances through your sleeping space, making sure you never forget it's there. The floor isn't made of stone or wood, it's earth, plain, compacted dirt. And when it rains or snows, that floor wakes up, softening into something between mud and misery. Cold creeps upward from the ground, wraps around your ankles, and seeps into the straw mattress like a ghost no prayer can banish. And above you, the thatched roof sags with snow and leaks with the confidence of a sieve. If it doesn't collapse, it's probably sheltering a squirrel, a bird, or something worse. This wasn't comfort. This was survival. And somehow, it worked. When night fell, the cold thickened. There were no bedrooms, no mattresses, no privacy. The medieval peasant didn't slip beneath a feather-filled quilt or nestle into memory foam. They laid down on sacks of straw or on the bare floor itself, with only their cloaks and each other for warmth. A bed, if it existed, was a wooden frame crammed with hay, rushes, and occasionally a handful of herbs like rosemary or lavender, not for sleep, but to mask the smell of livestock and smoke. The straw flattened quickly, molded faster, and welcomed all manner of tiny, biting visitors, fleas, lice, and whatever else wandered in from the goat pen. So they improvised a far more ancient solution, each other. The whole family would pile together into the warmest corner of the house, turning themselves into something less like a household and more like a slow-breathing creature made of people. Parents, children, grandparents, even the dog, even the goat, curled into one another until body heat became the only reliable insulation. In winter, modesty died quietly, and survival came in layers, sometimes literal, sometimes familial. Those on the edge of the pile bore the worst of it. If you were lucky, you slept in the center, swaddled in warmth. If not, you were the sacrificial wall, shielding your kin from the wind sneaking in through the cowhide-covered window hole. They slept nose to nose, ankle to shoulder, shoulder to goat. It wasn't comfort. It was a ritual, one honed by centuries of need. And somehow, with frozen breath dancing over their heads and a fire barely hanging on, they drifted off, warm enough to survive until morning. In every medieval peasant home, there was one sacred place, one warm center that made the difference between life and death, the hearth. It wasn't grand, no carved mantle, no chimney sweeping smoke up to the sky, just a sunken pit or circle of blackened stones, usually in the middle of the floor, where a few embers glowed stubbornly against the freezing dark. It smoked, sputtered, coughed, and half the time it filled the room with more haze than heat. But it was everything. Fire meant survival. Without it, you didn't just suffer, you slipped away. Quietly, like ice melting into silence. Matches didn't exist, lighters weren't even dreamt of. So medieval families clung to their fire like a final heartbeat. Every night, before sleep, someone in the household performed the ancient and crucial ritual of fire banking. They'd carefully pile ash over the glowing coals, not to smother them, but to shield them. The ash trapped the heat, keeping the embers just barely alive until morning. If done right, you could return at dawn, clear the ash with a stick, add some dry twigs, and the fire would rise again, like breath from sleep. But if you failed, if a gust of wind found its way through a crack in the wall, or if the ash was too damp, or not packed just so, morning would begin with frozen fingers, a silent hearth, and the long, cruel process of trying to bring flame back from stone and steel. So someone always stayed watch. Shifts passed between children, parents, elders. Even at 3 a.m., half asleep, someone would poke the fire, add peat, whisper curses or prayers, because in that little ember glowing under a crust of ash was not just warmth, but life itself. When the fire began to fade and blankets were never thick enough, peasants turned to their most unlikely source of warmth: livestock. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, anything with a heartbeat and body heat was invited in, not for decoration, not even for food, but for survival. Bringing animals inside the home wasn't just some charming medieval quirk, it was a strategy. In a house with no insulation, no sealed windows, and floors that oozed winter from below, the only thing more precious than fire was body heat. And the more warm bodies, the better. A cow gave off a surprising amount of warmth, so did pigs. Goats were feisty but efficient. Chickens, while not exactly cozy, offered pockets of heat wherever they roosted. Peasants didn't care about the smell, the noise, or the mess. They cared about waking up alive. At night, a single-room home transformed into a living furnace. Pigs snorted in straw piles. Chickens nestled in corners. A cow might lie against the wall, chewing cud and fogging the air with its breath. Goats, being goats, found their way onto everything, from bedding to firewood piles. It wasn't glamorous. The scent was legendary. But it worked. The combined heat of people and animals could push the inside temperature of a hut just a few degrees above freezing. And sometimes those few degrees were the difference between survival and frostbite. Medieval peasants didn't need to study thermodynamics. They lived it, night after night, with hooves beside their heads and feathers in their blankets. Now let's talk about fashion. Not silk gowns or tailored coats, but the itchy, grimy, lumpy layering that kept medieval peasants just warm enough to live another day. There was no such thing as winter clothes. There was only whatever you owned, and in January you wore all of it. First came the linen shirt, rough, scratchy, rarely clean, then wool, as much wool as you could get your hands on, tunics layered over tunics, leg wrappings tied around old stockings. If it smelled vaguely of goat and still held heat, it went on your body. Boots, a rare luxury. Most wrapped their feet in rags and shoved them into wooden clogs, praying their toes wouldn't blacken by morning. Gloves were scraps of leather stitched together. Hats, treasured beyond gold. A single wool cap could be the difference between surviving the night or waking with hair frozen to the wall. And then there was dirt, not by accident, not by laziness, but by strategy. You see, when you haven't bathed in weeks and your clothes are caked in smoke, sweat, and old sheep grease, something curious happens. You get warmer. All that grime filled the tiny gaps in your clothing, locking in heat like a second skin. It wasn't pleasant, but it was effective. Some peasants believed washing in winter could make you sick. Many avoided it entirely, turning their tunics into crusty, stained, but surprisingly efficient armor against the cold. They didn't dress to impress. They dressed to not die. If you're picturing a bed right now, something soft, springy, maybe with a few fluffy pillows, let it go. The medieval peasant's bed was far simpler and far crunchier. A bed, if you had one, was little more than a wooden frame stuffed with straw, hay, or old dried rushes. That's it. No mattress, no pillow top, just layers of dead plants, and sometimes the occasional live bug for bonus discomfort. Over time, that straw would flatten, rot, and develop a smell that was memorable. Most peasants didn't change their bedding often. Some just piled new rushes over the old ones, creating a kind of composting carpet beneath their bodies. It wasn't a bed, it was a slowly decomposing memory foam made of weeds. And if you couldn't afford a frame, you didn't worry. You simply spread the straw right onto the compacted dirt floor. Earth-connected slumber, as a modern influencer might call it. But back then, it was necessity, not aesthetic. The cold seeped up from below like a silent fog, so even your dreams had to learn how to shiver. Tossing and turning wasn't for comfort, it was survival. If one side of your body got too cold, you turned over. If your straw shifted beneath you, well, congratulations. That was the night's entertainment. But somehow, in all this crunching, itching and freezing, sleep did come. Because even the poorest, most exhausted bodies need to rest, especially when tomorrow means another battle with the cold. When you live in a hut made of sticks and mud, winter doesn't knock politely. It barges in, through walls, through gaps, through roofs that sigh beneath snow. So medieval peasants fought back, not with insulation or engineering, but with whatever they could grab. Old cloth, moss from trees, bundles of straw, sheep's wool, or even tufts of animal hair. If it could stuff a crack and stop a breeze, it was valuable. Each night was a tiny war. You'd check the corners, patch a new gap, press rags into the holes near the roof. Sometimes they'd smear on a fresh layer of mud and dung, thick and sticky, muttering that it was good stuff this year. Because in this world, warmth outranked dignity. Roofs were especially tricky. Thatched bundles sagged after rain, leaked after snow, and occasionally dropped a frog into your stew. Sleep wasn't sacred. It was tactical. In most homes, someone always stayed awake, tending the fire, watching the wind, nudging logs and muttering to coals. They didn't call it ember duty, but that's exactly what it was, because if the fire died out, so might you. The night was divided loosely. One person would sleep while another poked at the hearth, keeping the embers breathing. No alarms, no rotations written down, just a rhythm born of habit and fear. Even children were taught young. If you feel the cold rising, get up and check the fire. If you wake and the room is dark, wake someone else. There was no such thing as sleeping through the night. And when your turn came to rest, it wasn't peaceful. You'd fall asleep to someone pacing the floor, maybe a goat snoring beside you, and the wind teasing the edges of your patched-up home. But you'd sleep, knowing someone was there, protecting the fire like it was a fragile little god in a ring of stone. Even breath could betray you. In the coldest winters, peasants learned to breathe differently, not deeply, not fast, but slow and shallow, through the nose, always. Why? Because inhaling a lungful of frozen air could hurt. It could burn. It could lead to coughing fits that didn't stop. And in the medieval world, coughing too much could mean the end. So they learned. Cover your face with a bit of wool. Wrap a scarf if you had one. Sleep with a rag gently tied across your mouth. Some nights people would wake with frost on their lips but lungs still working. Even breathing had rules. Breathe soft. Breathe small. Breathe like you're hiding from winter itself. There was one more ally in the war against cold: food, warm porridge, onion soup, a clay pot of something thick and steaming left by the fire. It wasn't rich, it wasn't plenty, but if it filled your belly and brought warmth to your core, it was precious. In winter, peasants relied on whatever they could store: root vegetables, grains, beans, sometimes dried meat or salt pork. Most meals were boiled into something that could stretch for days. Gruel wasn't just common, it was essential. Hot food wasn't about flavor, it was about fire on the inside. A warm bowl of oats could raise your body temperature just enough to sleep through the coldest hours. Even sipping something boiled kept the chill from setting too deep in your bones. They didn't eat for pleasure, they ate to survive the night. When you didn't have firewood, furs, or extra bodies, you improvised. Peasants learned to heat smooth river stones in the hearth. Once hot, they'd wrap them in cloth and tuck them beneath their straw bedding or press them against cold feet. The stone would lose its heat quickly, but not before offering an hour of relief. Some homes had thick clay bottles or jugs that could be filled with warm water and used the same way. Others simply heated tools, bricks, even scraps of iron, anything that could carry heat into the night. It wasn't glamorous. Sometimes it smelled of soot and ash, but that heat, held close like a secret, was worth everything. By now, you've noticed a pattern. Alone, the cold was brutal. Together, it became survivable. Medieval families slept like stacked logs, layered, pressed, wrapped together into shapes that made modesty vanish and warmth multiply. Some slept in rows, others curled in tangled heaps. One traveler once described it as a pile of people like God's own lasagna. If someone shifted, everyone felt it. If one woke up, all stirred, but no one complained. Because in that pile, your chances of seeing morning were higher. Some slept face to foot, others spooned like packed firewood. It wasn't beautiful, but it worked. And then, morning. If you made it to dawn, there was relief. Not warmth, no, the hut was still an icebox. But light had returned, and with it, a small victory. The embers were checked. Fire coaxed back to life. Chickens rustled, pigs yawned. Children rose slowly, stiff but breathing. Your joints cracked like branches. Your clothes were stiff with cold, but you were alive. Sometimes the frost kissed your eyebrows. Sometimes you had to crack the ice in your water bucket just to drink. But none of that mattered. You'd survived the night. Again. Cold didn't just shape homes. It shaped relationships. In the harshest winters, peasants turned to one another, not for charity, but for survival. Families would visit neighbors, not for gossip, but to share fire. If one home had a working hearth, others would gather around it. Sometimes entire households would sleep in a single hut, bundled together like a woven basket of humanity. Grandparents, children, strangers, they all lay side by side because warmth wasn't owned. It was shared. Even food was passed across frozen fences. A pot of soup could warm 5 bellies instead of 1. And if someone ran out of firewood, someone else gave a log, because tomorrow they might be the ones without. Not every remedy made sense, but peasants used whatever they had. Hot drinks were prized. Herbal teas brewed from dried nettles, chamomile, or even garlic were sipped slowly beside the fire. Some swore by hot beer, spiced with honey and cloves, to chase the chill from the chest. Others boiled onions or horseradish and inhaled the steam to open the blood. A bit of warm milk was considered a gift from heaven. Some peasants rubbed goose fat onto the skin before sleep, not because it felt good, but because fat sealed in warmth. It was messy, it was sticky, but it worked sometimes. Even with every trick, every fire, every shared blanket, some didn't wake up. The cold was quiet. It didn't storm or shout. It crept. It slowed your heart, stilled your breath, and lulled the weak into a final, gentle sleep. Children were the most vulnerable. Elders, too. If a night turned colder than expected, a home could wake to silence. No one cried. There was no strength for wailing, only quiet prayers, and a new bundle to carry to the churchyard when the ground thawed. For many, death didn't come with fear. It came with stillness, coldness so complete that it felt like rest. Still, most woke up, again and again, year after year, generation after generation, through cracked walls, thin soup, coughing fits, and nights colder than memory. They survived. They tended the fire. They tucked in their children. They gave the warm side of the bed to someone else. They stuffed more straw in the cracks and hoped it would hold. They didn't know they were tough. They didn't have time to reflect. But their survival was an act of quiet strength, a steady defiance of nature's sharpest weapon. Morning always began the same way, with fire. Someone, usually whoever slept closest, would rise before the others, shake off stiffness, and gently brush away the ash. If the embers lived, there was hope. If not, they'd strike flint on steel until sparks caught dry moss or bark. This was more than warmth. It was rhythm. The fire meant porridge, light, comfort, life. Until it burned, the day hadn't truly started. There were no clocks. The fire was the heartbeat of the home. The cold never really went away. It lived beside them. It was in their clothes, in their food, in their skin. It shaped their routines, their homes, their traditions. Peasants didn't escape winter. They endured it year after year until its presence became ordinary. They made peace with frost, with wind, with nights so dark you couldn't see your own hand. And somehow, in all that hardship, they carved out life, with warm porridge, with shared breath, with fire that kept glowing even when everything else froze. The cold never left, but neither did they. They laughed, even when the walls leaked, even when their feet were numb, even when death visited next door, they still laughed. Humor was warmth. A shared joke around a fire could light the belly better than soup. They told stories, wild ones, weird ones, about ghosts that slipped through chimneys or pigs that talked when no one was looking. It wasn't foolish. It was fuel. In those dark months, laughter wasn't just allowed. It was needed. When the wind howled too loud, peasants sang louder, not for performance, but for peace. Mothers hummed lullabies while rocking babies swaddled in cloaks. Elders sang folk verses passed down for generations about winter spirits, lost loves, and saints who lit fires in dreams. Even if voices cracked, it didn't matter. The melody wasn't about perfection. It was about company and comfort. They didn't have much, so what they had, they gave. A crust of bread, a log, a shared blanket, a moment by the fire. These things weren't small. They were life. Kindness was currency, and survival often depended not on strength, but generosity. If one child was cold, another gave their scarf. If a widow's fire died, the village came to relight it. The cold was cruel. The people were not. In winter, time moved differently. The sun barely rose. Shadows stretched forever. Days blurred into long twilight. Time wasn't counted by bells or hours, but by warmth. When the fire needs more wood, or after the soup finishes, everything slowed, and in that slowness they found rhythm, peace even, a winter stillness that wrapped the world in quiet pause. They dreamed of warmth, a lost summer, a full hearth, a cloak without holes. Some dreams were hopeful, others strange, fires that walked, goats that whispered secrets, snow that melted when sung to. Prayer was breath, a whisper into the steam rising from a bowl, a murmur in the dark, a glance upward when lighting the fire. They didn't expect miracles, but they hoped, for warmth, for health, for one more winter survived. Each home held little rituals, crosses made of twigs, Saint charms hung near the hearth, ashes smudged on doors. Faith wasn't loud, it was steady. After the fire was banked, after everyone was still, came the stories. Tales of haunted forests, trickster foxes, brave girls with glowing hands. Nothing written, only spoken, passed from mouth to ear like secret spells. Storytelling didn't pass the time, it preserved the soul, it warmed the mind when the feet were frozen. Nothing ever really dried. Clothes were hung over the hearth, smoked and steamed for hours. They smelled like peat and sweat and meat, still damp, but better than ice. They layered those clothes anyway, still warm from the smoke, still stiff with frost. In winter, you didn't wait for dry. You wore whatever had survived the last fire. The coldest days were silent, until you heard the crack, the thwack, firewood being split. The sound meant more than heat. It meant motion, energy, hope. If a neighbor was chopping, you knew they were alive. You'd poke your head out, nod. That was the whole conversation. In a winter where words froze mid-air, the sound of survival was enough. They weren't warriors, not in armor, not in songs. But what they did, day after cold day, was a quiet kind of bravery, enduring the dark, holding the fire, sharing warmth, choosing kindness, wrapping a child in the last dry cloak instead of themselves. History didn't crown them, but maybe tonight we can. There were days when even fire couldn't warm the soul. The cold didn't just bite the skin, it seeped into thoughts, into hearts. There were mornings when peasants stared into the fire, not moving, just watching, just breathing. Some called it winter sickness, a quiet weight that made even small tasks feel like mountains. The cold could break the body, but worse, it could crack the spirit. Still, they rose, slowly, silently, because giving in wasn't an option, not yet. But no winter lasts forever. The first sign was so small, most missed it. A sound, water, dripping. Not much, but steady. The snow on the roof softened. The path turned to mud. The fire still burned. The nights were still cruel. But something had shifted. The breath of spring was whispering behind the frost. And for peasants who had counted time by icicles and hunger, that sound, drip, 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 was as sacred as a church bell. The first green thing was a miracle, a blade of grass pushing up through the frozen mud, a sprig of something near the door, maybe nettle, maybe nothing. But it was colour, and that was everything. Children pointed, elders whispered prayers, some plucked it and tied it to their wall for luck. It didn't feed you, it didn't warm you, but it reminded you. The earth hadn't given up, and neither had they. The sun returned slowly, but it returned. Each day the light stayed a little longer. Shadows shortened. Meals didn't have to be eaten in darkness. The hut felt less like a cave and more like a home. And with the light came laughter again. Not the forced kind, not desperate. Real laughter, blooming like spring from inside tired chests. The cold wasn't gone, but it was losing. They didn't talk about resilience, or strength, or bravery. They didn't write poems about endurance or paint pictures of survival. They just lived. One day, then the next. They didn't see themselves as heroes. But maybe now, centuries later, we can. They were not just survivors of the cold. They were architects of warmth, carriers of quiet courage. They were proof that even the weakest walls can protect the strongest hearts. Winter was cruel, but it wasn't their identity. They were not the suffering. They were the surviving, the laughing, the adapting, the stubborn breath that refused to vanish into the frost. The season pressed down on them, but it didn't press them flat. Instead, they bent, and when spring came, they rose again, stronger in silence, wiser in warmth. Nothing was wasted, not time, not food, not fire. Even the cold was used. Ash was saved for soap, bones were carved into buttons, broken tools were reforged, old straw was turned into new bedding, even melted snow was collected like treasure. They didn't call it sustainability, they called it life. They made warmth out of scraps and strength out of what others would throw away. When spring finally arrived, it wasn't subtle. It shouted, it bloomed, it poured green into the grey, and for those who had lived inside winter's teeth, it felt like heaven rising from the soil. The birds returned, the goats gave birth, the fields softened beneath their hands. The first bite of fresh greens was a prayer answered. Winter didn't kill them, and now the earth itself was singing their name. Those huts are gone now, the straw rotted, the walls collapsed, but their lives are still here, under the earth, between the trees, in the bones of old stones. When we walk over fields or through forests, we are walking where they lived, loved, and shivered. Their breath shaped the world, their warmth lingered. They are not forgotten, just quiet. Tonight, you didn't just listen to history, you slept with it. You curled beside the hearth, you tucked straw around your toes, you listened to the wind whisper through the walls. You shared a blanket with the past. So rest now, time traveler. The fire is safe, the wind has passed, and the people who came before you are smiling in their sleep. Good night. Once the ice was gone, it didn't vanish entirely. It lived on in their joints, in their stories, in the way they packed straw more carefully the next year. The frost remained in memory, not as terror, but as teacher. It taught them what mattered: a dry roof, a working fire, a laugh shared before sleep. Every chill taught them the value of a single degree of warmth. They passed these lessons down, not in books, but in practice. Children learned to listen to wind, to judge the sky by its color, to tell the difference between snow and snow that would stay. And so, even in spring, the cold whispered through them, not to scare, but to remind. They didn't speak of love the way we do. No poems, no declarations by candlelight, but it was there, in the way they wrapped another layer over their child, in the way they offered the warm corner of the fire without asking, in the way a father left his boots for someone smaller and went barefoot through snow. It wasn't loud, it was practical, but no less sacred. Love meant surviving together, and it meant giving up your share sometimes, so someone else might have more warmth, more food, more chance. That kind of love didn't melt with spring. It stayed, in the bones, in the soil, in the stories they never told, but always lived. History forgot their names, but that doesn't mean they were poor. They were rich in instinct, rich in adaptation, rich in ways our books don't bother to count. They didn't build cathedrals, but they built lives, stitched together with warmth and ash and breadcrumbs shared across cold rooms. We think of them as lacking, but what they lacked in luxury they made up for in presence. They were in the world, in the wind, in the straw, in the silence between breaths. They didn't write, but they lived stories no parchment could hold. Their hands were always busy, always cracked, always dirty. But that dirt, it was sacred. It came from feeding others, from building warmth, from holding life together with fingers that bled but never dropped what mattered. The soot in their skin told stories of straw lifted, animals tended, children carried. The ache in their shoulders was their hymn. The blister was their scripture. Work wasn't a burden. It was the way they said, "I love you. I won't let you go cold." If sainthood lived anywhere, it lived beneath their nails. Long before we had central heating, we had them. They were the fire before the flame, the warmth before the stove, the spark that refused to go out, even when wind howled, even when nights lasted forever. Every generation after them carries a piece of that flame, in the way we wrap a blanket around someone else, in the way we stir soup for someone sick, in the way we sit closer, wordlessly, when the room turns cold. We call it instinct, but maybe it's memory, maybe it's them. Once the ice was gone, it didn't vanish entirely. It lived on in their joints, in their stories, in the way they packed straw more carefully the next year. The frost remained in memory, not as terror, but as teacher. It taught them what mattered: a dry roof, a working fire, a laugh shared before sleep. Every chill taught them the value of a single degree of warmth. They passed these lessons down, not in books, but in practice. Children learned to listen to wind, to judge the sky by its color, to tell the difference between snow and snow that would stay. And so, Even in spring, the cold whispered through them, not to scare, but to remind. They didn't speak of love the way we do, no poems, no declarations by candlelight, but it was there, in the way they wrapped another layer over their child, in the way they offered the warm corner of the fire without asking, in the way a father left his boots for someone smaller and went barefoot through snow. It wasn't loud, it was practical, but no less sacred. Love meant surviving together, and it meant giving up your share sometimes so someone else might have more warmth, more food, more chance. That kind of love didn't melt with spring. It stayed, in the bones, in the soil, in the stories they never told, but always lived.
History forgot their names, but that doesn't mean they were poor. They were rich in instinct, rich in adaptation, rich in ways our books don't bother to count. They didn't build cathedrals, but they built lives, stitched together with warmth and ash and breadcrumbs shared across cold rooms. We think of them as lacking, but what they lacked in luxury they made up for in presence. They were in the world, in the wind, in the straw, in the silence between breaths. They didn't write, but they lived stories no parchment could hold. Their hands were always busy, always cracked, always dirty. But that dirt, it was sacred. It came from feeding others, from building warmth, from holding life together with fingers that bled but never dropped what mattered. The soot in their skin told stories of straw lifted, animals tended, children carried. The ache in their shoulders was their hymn. The blister was their scripture. Work wasn't a burden. It was the way they said, "I love you. I won't let you go cold." If sainthood lived anywhere, it lived beneath their nails. Long before we had central heating, we had them. They were the fire before the flame, the warmth before the stove, the spark that refused to go out, even when wind howled, even when nights lasted forever. Every generation after them carries a piece of that flame, in the way we wrap a blanket around someone else, in the way we stir soup for someone sick, in the way we sit closer, wordlessly, when the room turns cold. We call it instinct. But maybe it's memory. Maybe it's them. They didn't know they were building the future. They just lived. They didn't plan legacies. They whispered them, through habits, through kindness, through breath rising in cold rooms that somehow felt like home. The way they stirred soup, the way they lit fires, the way they held each other in silence. These became memory's deepest roots, and we carry them still, in the way we reach for warmth, the way we hold close, the way we survive ordinary darkness. They never met us, but we are built from their quiet. They don't need statues. They don't need their names carved in stone. They are remembered in the way we cover someone else with a blanket, in the way we give up the warmer side of the bed, in the way we add an extra scoop of soup to a bowl, just in case someone needs more. They were not kings, not saints, but they cared, deeply, constantly, quietly. And that kind of love does not fade. It does not disappear in the fog of time. It waits, it lingers, and it becomes us. There is a kind of warmth that outlives fire. It lives in the hush of stories told by flickering light, in the steam rising from soup, in the sound of breath slowing safely into sleep. It travels across centuries, unchanged, invisible, but strong. It's the warmth of being seen, of being held, of being carried forward by people you never knew, but who somehow knew you'd come one day. And so, they left something behind. Not gold, not glory, but comfort, gentle, quiet, eternal. You've walked beside them now, through wind, through straw, through the quiet bravery of dark nights lit by small fires and strong hearts. You've shared their blankets, you've seen through their eyes, and now your story curls beside theirs, another line in the great unrecorded history of people who made it through. Sleep now, not as an outsider, but as a companion to the past. You are not alone. You never were. So now, let the cold slip away. Let the snow melt. Let the embers sigh. You've survived the long night of history. You've held the hands of those who endured it without needing to be remembered. You've slept beside their strength. You've listened to their silence. And maybe, just maybe, a part of their fire still glows inside you. Sleep well, time traveler. Rest gently. The past is still. The story is safe. The cold is gone. And you,